I'd like to ask our next panel to please come up to the stage. And they will discuss how the government and industry work together to enhance safety through the process of mining safety data. Captain Steve Jangelis serves as our safety chair, and he will moderate this panel of a virtual who's who in the aviation safety data arena. Steve?
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming back after the break and joining us for this great panel on data. Data, it's a really big keyword. Data, get me the data. I need the data. Bring me the data. We've heard it a lot. We've in the boardroom, sometimes on the flight deck. I need the data to upload. It's something we're doing every day, day in and day out, and it's a relatively new concept. Data and analytics. Back in the mid-90s, some of you may know this story about the great general manager of the Oakland Athletics, Billy Beane, really pioneered looking at data and using it to the best advantage. A lot of people were looking at his trades. He was trading for people that were on the backside of their career. He was looking for just that edge, and people couldn't figure it out, and he eventually put together a championship team. The Oakland Athletics did a really good job in 2002, and he's credited for taking them as far as they did to the World Series. What he did was he started to take a look at things that were out there, such as, on a sunny, clear day, on a Tuesday, if I put a right-handed pitcher up against a left-handed batter, 73% of the time they will strike that batter out. But at night, that number would drop to less than half. No one was looking at that. And now it's a mantra in the sports world, but it's also transferred over to business. Corporations are using data now. We've heard about data analytics, and some of this data could be used for good and some could be used for bad. Our panel today is going to talk about the good side in our business, in aviation, and what we do to make flying safer. Flying's the safest it's ever been, and a lot of it, some people want to take credit for it. In fact, it's been tweeted out that some people like to take credit for it. Just down the street off Pennsylvania Avenue, a gentleman there says that he's responsible for safety, but I really want to point the light at everyone in this room. I think we're the reason why flying is as safe as it ever has been. We're moving more people to further away places, and we're doing a really good job. But really good job is not enough. The public expects us to be perfect. We can't accept any less. So as we start to talk about our data collection and what we do, each and every person who fills out a safety report is a vital part of this data collection. And it helps us as we move into the boardrooms and as we start to sit in closed doors and start to say, hey, maybe this data, we need to look at this, because to quote the Transportation Safety Board Chairman of Canada, Chairperson of Canada, Kathy Fox, she said, your next accident is in your data today. So we definitely take that to heart, and we try to mine that data and look for it. So to start off, I'd like to introduce the rest of my panel here today. First with Captain Michael Quiello, Vice President of Corporate Safety, Security, and Environment for United Airlines, and also the CAST Commercial Aviation Safety Team Co-Chairman. Captain Neil Raaz, Joint Implementation Measurement Data Analysis Team Co-Chair. That's short for JIMDAT, which we'll be speaking about a little bit later. Mr. Vivek Sood, he serves as the Technical Advisor on Vulnerability, Discovery, and Safety Measurement, and acts as a government co-chair for a lot of these groups and working groups that we form to mine this data. Captain Mike Schilz, he's an Airbus A320 line check airman, a FOQA gatekeeper, which stands for Flight Operations Quality Assurance. And he's a longtime multifaceted ALPA volunteer in a number of places. Everybody knows Mike. He's taught classes, he's been on panels, and we've seen him around many places. Captain Craig Hoskins, Vice President of Safety, Security, and Technical Affairs for Airbus Americas. And last but not least, Captain Terry McVenes, Director of System Safety and Regulatory Affairs for Boeing Commercial Airplanes, and most notably, a gentleman who was the Executive Air Safety Chairman for ALPA. So when I say, and you've heard me say, I walk in big shoes, that gentleman's who I look to, and I appreciate the mentorship, and thanks for the guidance along the way. 2 points. Here's 2 data points I'm going to put on everybody. We have the largest panel. We have the most people on the stage. That's one. But number two, everyone here is a pilot. So we're pilots talking with pilots. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So when we talk about data and we start to, say, what do corporations do with that data? I think that, just those couple examples I mentioned are good examples. But Michael, in the boardroom of a large corporation, what's the group think about data and how it comes in and what we do with it?
Well, I would say that, technology is just growing exponentially, and data and availability of data is just out there. And so when you look at what we're doing at United Airlines from a marketing perspective, we're doing things that we didn't even conceive of a year and a half ago because of data and micro-marketing. Do you target certain demographics or certain areas for data? But I tell a lot of stories about data, and I tell you that Home Depot, when you go into Home Depot, you'll see caulk. And if you go into a normal hardware store, caulk is on one shelf someplace. But you go to Home Depot, it's all over the store. And it's because they have this relationship based on data that when you buy this, most likely you're going to need some caulk. And so they tend to put it together. You'll see screws or nails and nail guns, because when you buy nails, you turn around, which is a very low volume, maybe low profit margin item, but you'll turn around and there's a nail gun right next to it, and it's not in the tool aisle. And because they know when you buy the nails, they get a certain amount of percentage that go by nail guns. I'm from Chicago, so McDonald's in Chicago, they can tell you by degree of the day. So when it's 85 degrees, they can tell you hamburger sales by store. And they do this for just in time for provision in their stores with hamburgers. And the best story is, and I know Steve likes this one, is that Walmart knows that when there's a hurricane in South Florida that people buy Pop-Tarts because you can eat them raw. But they also like to buy strawberry Pop-Tarts. So when there's a hurricane predicted for South Florida, they start shipping product down there. And it's all based on data. It's really interesting on how you can do this relationship between something and data. And I think in our business, the SAP reports is that relationships. Because we have all this empirical data about what an airplane does, but we need to conditionalize that data. And we conditionalize that data with SAP.
Very good. And that's the key. Being able to look at our data, and like we said earlier, that we can start to take a look at incidents and be reactive about it, or we can start predicting that risk. And the group that has been formed many years ago, that I have the great pleasure of being a part of, the Commercial Aviation Safety Team. All of us are members of that, and ASIAS, the Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing System. Try to repeat that 3 times fast. But for short, we call it CAST and ASIAS. And CAST and ASIAS was formed just about a little over 20 years ago. And the reasons it was formed was to get this data and bring it to the forefront. And for a historical standpoint, where were we at as an industry when we started this effort? Vivek, Terry, perhaps, historically?
I think when collectively as industry we kind of look back, almost going back 2 decades, commercial aviation safety was under the microscope. We were having some undesired events happening. They were in the headlines. There was increased scrutiny from the public, congressional, and expectations demanded better. We as an industry knew we needed to do better, and there were sporadic efforts underway even before that in trying to find a new way of doing things, not being reactive, waiting for something to fail and then fix and then wait again. But that required creating different sources of information. We talked about data. That is the fundamental of everything we do and how we improve safety. We didn't have the right sources of data. We were still dealing in a reactive mode. But those were kind of sporadic efforts, and what kind of really helped gel everything together, at the time we had the White House Commission on Civil Aviation report came out, the National Civil Aviation Review panel was meeting, and they came out with 2 key recommendations. That one, challenged the industry to reduce the fatal accident rate by 80% over 10 years, which at that time was considered a very ambitious goal. How in the world are we going to achieve this? But also, from the NCAR panel, really was the impetus for CAST, that government and industry need to work together. We need to find a new way of collaborating, working together on a common safety agenda. And that kind of helped give that final momentum to form the commercial aviation safety team. And kind of what you see on the panel here, they're representative of key stakeholders in our industry, and there are a lot more organizations that are not here, but pioneering a way, and it took time. It was not a meeting overnight and all of a sudden we have collaboration. I think a lot of you were involved in those meetings and setting up the seeds for the voluntary safety programs, establishing that safety culture that would give way to what we see today in terms of the collaboration we see across the board. And all of us are focused on the very thing. What happens in our system? Why did it go wrong? Let's understand it and let's fix it. And that changed a new mentality. I think, Terry, you've been there from the start.
Yeah, we were, certainly in the early days of CAST, we were really looking at the low-hanging fruit. What were the things that we could identify to look backwards and solve some of the problems that existed? As the FOQA and ASAP program started to come online with the individual carriers, we also saw an opportunity of looking at it across the entire system, which really was the genesis of the thought process behind ASIAS, where we could actually take the information that we were gleaning from each of the individual airline programs, put them together and look across the entire system. And a lot of it really started, the airline I was with was US Airways. We would have some, say, unofficial meetings with United Airlines to talk about things they were seeing in their programs, comparing some notes. And that was really the genesis, I think, of the thought process behind ASIAS, how we could share that information together. And then as more and more of the ASAP programs came online and FOQA programs, putting that all together into what's today the ASIAS program, added that other dimension to what we were already doing in CAST to give better data that wasn't always just reactive, looking reactively, but probably looking a little bit proactively in what we could be doing going forward.
Yeah, can I add some, let me add some data, because we always talk about data. If we had the same accident rate today that we had in 1997 when CAST was formed, we'd lose an aircraft every 3 weeks. I mean, just think about that from a data perspective. We would lose an aircraft every 3 weeks. And it's amazing what we all do as an industry. I read a report not long ago that it's more dangerous to be a pedestrian on a sidewalk than it is to get on an airplane. And that's a commentary on what everybody in this room does, what we all do together as working together as a team. John Hopkins said 241,000 people got killed by medical mistakes in the hospitals last year. 33,000 on cars, automobiles, 200 on the railroads. And think about what we do. Up until the tragedy of April, we flew 5.8 billion passengers, 3/4 of the population of the world, without a fatality. That's absolutely amazing when you look at it. But that doesn't mean we didn't come close, that we didn't have these almost near misses. And that's why when we all look as a team, we crave that data. How do you get that data in to see, where we're almost having an issue? And then how do we as a team fix it? And when you bring the team together, you have all these constituents, and everybody has a concern about something. But the good thing about what we do on CAS and what we do in ASIAS is that we all listen to each other. You don't necessarily have to agree, but we listen to each other and we solve problems for the common good. And the results are in the data, and the results are in the numbers that we produce. So I think when I say we, not us here on the stage, but all of us as an industry, because when somebody gets hurt or somebody loses an aircraft, we all lose an aircraft. We don't compete on safety, and we don't have paint on the side of the airplanes when it comes to safety.
That's so incredibly true. And I think that 20-year number is critical to understand, because this has been a very slow and deliberate process. From the very, very beginning, the envision was, if we're going to bring everyone to the table, everyone needs to have a comfort level. Flight data is very, very sensitive. It's sensitive from the corporate perspective, and it's certainly sensitive from the pilot perspective and our frontline teammates. That 20 years was a slow, deliberate process to make sure that every stakeholder in the process understood that the purposes for this data was going to be only used for the advancement of flight safety. And working with the regulators, working with the manufacturers, OEMs, and working across all the stakeholders, including our labor friends, was critical to that process. So again, slow, deliberate, make sure that everybody has full transparency. and the data from beginning to end and how it's going to be used. That's critical to our success.
Yeah, and I would tell you, we've all made mistakes. You know, we've made mistakes personally, professionally, financially. We've all made mistakes, and we made mistakes probably in the genesis of the program itself. But we just can't keep looking back and say, well, back in 1999, you know, this is what happened, and, you know, we don't want that to happen again. Well, no kidding, we don't either. And so we fix it, we talk through it, and then we make sure that it doesn't happen again. And so I would just say that if you're having doubts about anything, be progressive in your thoughts, and have that conversation. And let us understand what the concerns are, and then we can talk through your concerns and make sure that everybody understands that this is only going to be used for the best of reasons.
And that it's de-identified,
And it's all
both at the
de-identified,
corporate
yeah.
level and at the individual level.
Yeah, we're not interested in an individual, that's for sure.
And I think that's if you look for the glue that's tied all this together, it's trust. It's the trust that's been established not only at the collaborative level of the CAST and the SIAS, industry and stakeholders and regulator working together, but CAST can't do its work if the SIAS doesn't have data to fuel the analysis. The SIAS can't bring that data together if individual operators don't have successful voluntary safety programs. And those safety programs can't produce benefit until we have a culture where everyone in the system at the front end can actually report safety concerns and have a belief that if I stand up and say this is a safety issue, something happens. That data comes into the program, it gets addressed in a non-punitive manner. Let's find out what the problem is, let's understand what's behind it, and let's fix it, because we want to prevent it from occurring again. And I think that's the key that's fueled our success. And as we look forward, that's the trust that's enabling now SIAS to go beyond just looking at silos of data, but really building an integrated picture, system level of risk in the system. So we have a better understanding of how our system's behaving and gives us the best opportunity to influence that system in a positive way before we see any accidents or significant events in the system.
If you think about it, if you're out there and you're one of the decision makers, please don't use this availability of data to promote the other part of our job at ALPA, because it's just too important. Okay, you're talking about the safety of our passengers, the safety of our crews, who are ALPA people, and the future of our business. So don't use this as a pawn. Find something else. Find some other bargaining tool. But safety data, it's too darn important. And the possibilities are endless. And two of us are up here because our job is representing you on the boards that deal with this data and making sure that the data is used correctly. We got you covered. Just don't stop the flow of data.
And I would add to that, these programs are as important as the fuel you put on your airplanes.
Yep.
You expect the right amount of fuel, you expect having a well-trained, well-rested crew to work with. You should expect a quality safety program like FOQA and ASAP as part of your standard way of doing business.
No matter whose name is on the side of the airplane. This shouldn't just be for the legacy carriers. This should have always been for regional carriers as well. And believe me, the last 10 years, that has been a fight. It has gotten a lot better. But we've got a ways to go yet. That's why I'm still doing this job. When that job is done, I'm going to the lake.
To Terry's point, data is the fuel that drives flight safety in this day and age. And without that data, I don't see how we continue to move the needle and improve our industry, our profession, through the next 10 years. We've been incredibly successful the last 10.
Yeah, and I see a world, can you imagine a world where we never have to do a non-normal? Where you take off and you got such great reliability that you never have to open a book and do a non-normal. I see that world. And we're going to get to that world using data to understand, with 7 sensors on a flap system, even though they're within limits, we still get flap lockouts. Why is that? Well, when this flap limiter is on a high margin and this is on a low margin, you use that data to say, okay, let's change this out before you have those non-normals where you have to turn around and come back and land. And that world is within our grasp. And it'll increase reliability, it'll increase schedule reliability, it will lower costs. But just think of a world where we don't have to do non-normals. It's one of the top 5 risks in the system, I believe. System failures, non-power plant is one of the top 5 risks that I think that we look at. But that's well within our grasp.
You know, and if I might add as well from the manufacturer point of view, of course, don't ever say Boeing and Airbus don't get along, because not only that, we're both from Minnesota. So we got the Minnesota nice thing going on as well. But the one thing, you know, looking at the data and being part of this safety team, you know, another thing, like Terry and I, we share the same customers. And like Mike was saying, it doesn't matter what livery the aircraft is. The same thing holds true with, it doesn't matter what the manufacturer is as well. And from our perspective, you know, we look at, you know, in my previous life, I'd think about 900 to 1,000 flights a day, and now you think about 30,000 plus per day in the exposure that we have out there, and you think about the growth that, you know, our two companies are experiencing and the amount of traffic. So from the data perspective, we're looking at it from basically three different lenses. One is the aircraft itself, and how can we be better? And when you look at flight tests in our telemetry center, it looks like mission control in Houston, extracting all this data from the aircraft to make safety enhancements, and we call it safety beyond standard. Then the second part we look at is the aircraft operator themselves. We have a number of our operators around the world have 10 aircraft or less. And then, you know, Neil's company, American, is our largest customer in the world. So there's different levels of experience in sharing that data, and also in the safety culture is one piece. And then the third lens that we look at, which is probably the most challenging, which we all have a role in, is the air transport system itself. When you look at the air traffic, the airport infrastructure, and the different levels of maturity in some of the developing nations around the world and where we're at. So those three things we are focused on, and I'd like to think about, as a pilot, you always strove to have the perfect flight. And I thought, you know what, if you ever achieve that flight, you better quit. And go to the lake. But I think about, you know, where we look at it, you know, 10 to the minus 9th, and we look at it from a destination 10x. It's just 10 to the x, because we're striving for that perfect safety record that the other Mike was talking about. So that's kind of where we're looking at it. And I have one last thought thinking about Moneyball, is I just ordered the movie, he's not watching, for my boss in France. Because we took him to a baseball match, which is what they call it, last month when he was here, and it was the Beltway Series with the Nationals and the Orioles. So my wife and I took Yannick to the baseball match, and I was trying to explain the game to him, which became a lot more complicated in the data piece. But the first data point he received is they said, hey, we're going to go get a hot dog and a beer. He goes, okay, so we ordered 3 beers and 3 hot dogs. He goes, I've got this. And so anyway, the person at the counter says, that'll be $65. And Yannick looked at me, did she say $65? And I said, yep. I said, now just remember, you can always get better, but you can't pay more. So anyway, it kind of triggered the thought. So
Let me put it in terms that a simple mind like mine can relate to. Show of hands, how many of you have ever worked an accident? Did you have fun? Will you ever forget it? We're trying really hard so that you never, ever have to do that again. You don't have to get that smell in your nose and your mouth. You don't have to see that carnage. You don't have to deal with the devastation. That's why we're doing this. When I tell you the data is important, it's that important. I was amazed when they asked me to do that. You're honestly trying to get to a point where we can predict where an accident's going to happen and maybe stop it? I said, yeah. We're As Jay Pardee used to say, we're closer than we've ever been. We're getting there. We continue to need your support. So please don't cut that off now.
And there are lots of synergies in how this data is used, right? So aggregated, from the national airspace level, ATC looks at traffic flows, optimizes flows. At different organizations, technical operations is starting to understand how powerful the data is. Imagine a day when you show up to your 777 for your transatlantic flight, and an hour and a half before departure, you get a tail number swap. And you call your dispatcher and say, why am I getting a tail number swap at this late time? And the answer is because the data indicates that engine's going to fail in 6.2 hours. What are the safety implications of the data driving component change before it ever fails? To your point, eliminating the QRH procedure altogether. So as more departments, more organizations understand the power of the data, you're starting to see some really clever ways that data being used.
I was in a meeting last week with Ali Brahmi from the FAA and Dana Schilz from the NTSB, and she's the lead. She's the director of accident investigations. And we were talking about this data and really literally how her job has changed because there hasn't been a major accidents that she has to investigate. But she said, Michael, it's like going to my financial planner. Past performance is no indication of future performance, right? And so although we do really well at what we do as an industry and as a group sitting in this room today, let's not take our eye off the ball, if you will, and try to always understand what's out there. I was a chief pilot for a while, and I would tell you that of all the things I had to deal with, I would tell you 99.99% of the time, when a pilot had an incident, he or she didn't come to work to have that incident. Something happened. What was going on either with the machine, with the system, with the crew, and how do you get to the bottom of that so you can actually address it before you get on the airplane the next time, right? And so how do you become more proactive, and how do you become more predictive? Think of a day when you can sit in an airplane for the first time, and the constant is the airplane and the runway. But you got all these variables coming at you. Maybe the first time you're flying with this crew member. Maybe the weather is different. It's a crosswind, a headwind, snow, day, night. All those variables come in, and you get a list in front of you and say, these are all your risks based on data. And then how do you mitigate that risk as a crew member, as a captain? I tell our captains, our new captains, I said, we have 770 factories at United Airlines. They all $200, $300 million apiece. They generate $100,000 of revenue a day, $100 to $150,000 of revenue a day. It's an absentee workforce. You as the captain have an employee base of 12. If I gave you a factory on the south side of Chicago where we're $200, $250 million generating that kind of revenue, would I just ask you to just go out there and just do it? No, we want to make sure that the data comes in, that all those factories are running exactly the same, that you learn from the mistakes of somebody else and vice versa. But think of that, as a captain, think of that responsibility that you have. But also think about the accountability that you have. Because if we do lose an airplane, it's going to cost us as an industry, $1.8 to $2 billion. The X amount of dollars per passenger, plus the aircraft itself, plus the environmental damage, plus the reputational damage, all the things that happen when you have an accident. We just don't give those 4 stripes away thinking that it's a technical skill. We look to the captains as leaders, as business people, as somebody who's going to take all this data in, and it's going to crave this data because it's going to make their job not only better, but easier.
Excuse me, a great point is that each and every person who fills out a safety report, whether you are a flight attendant, a pilot, a mechanic, all gets put into this equation. It's all baked in. So when you think that my one report isn't going to change anything, you definitely will move the needle. We've heard this on the flight decks before. Somebody ought to fix that. Well, how does that somebody know what to fix if that report doesn't get written? So you could say something to the air traffic controllers and they may put a note down, but when you fill out a safety report, that generates movement. In our industry and our folks start to look at this at the airline level, at the FAA level, at the labor level. We also try to make sure that loose end gets tied. And it's important. And that's one thing we'd really like to emphasize. and you're ambassadors as well as safety professionals here in the room to spread the word and also to let folks know, to be trusted, to get those reports to us. I look down to Mike Schilz and I say, Mike, we're asking pilots to talk about things they see out there, but also what about the unseen, things that go on with the doors closed at altitude that don't get reported to anybody? How important is the single sole source report to this equation?
It's absolutely essential. Because think about it. You and your crewmate may be the only two people on the planet that know what just happened. You are there to witness it, you're there to analyze it, maybe confess to it, if it was really something scared the heck out of you. But it's something that you need to pass along to your fellow pilots so they don't put themselves in the same position. I talk about this. When I was in the Air Force, we had hangar fly. It involved everybody in the squadron showing up in the briefing room at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. There may have been a beer or two, and you'd sit around and talk about what happened that week. And eventually someone would go, boy, you should have seen what Al and I did on Tuesday. Yeah, what'd you do? Oh. And then they'd tell you. And then they'd go, don't do that. Well, how do you think the young guys in the squadron found out about how you could hurt yourself, Well, we've got 15,000 pilots at Delta. I'm pretty sure they don't want to spring for the beer. No, I shouldn't say that. I'm absolutely positive they don't want to spring for the beer. But if you think of ASAP as that hangar fly on steroids, that's what that is. Hey, I'm telling you, I did this in an A320. Don't go there. I've got thousands of hours of experience in a 320, and I did this, and I scared myself. So don't even put yourself in that situation. Okay, so I've now passed that down to all of the pilots in my airline. Well, guess what? I've also passed it down to all the pilots in the industry, because that ASAP report, that data point, is going right to ASIAS. And lucky for me, I'll get to see it again. Okay?
And from a manufacturer's perspective, it's just as important. We make great airplanes, whether it's Boeing, Airbus, and the others. They're wonderful airplanes, but we have no idea how they're really operated in the real world. And that's why we're involved too, because we want to understand how those airplanes are operated, what we can do to improve our products, make changes that need to be changed, look at that data and that information we're getting from the data for future designs. And that's why the manufacturers are involved with this as well, and it's so important. Craig, I'm sure you agree.
Definitely. I'm sure there's a number of, well, you're here at a safety forum, but before breaking airplanes, flying them, I worked in the maintenance side as well. And one of the things that we've been talking about in CAST from data points is getting the data from the maintenance folks. And when you look at the culture, the safety culture that we have, there's cultures within the culture, within an airline as well, whether it's flight ops or tech ops. And I'd like to take this opportunity as well as for those of you that are in leadership roles, is reaching out to and working with the folks in maintenance, because that's where there's a lot of data that we can mine from the maintenance folks. And you think about at night, one person doing something on an aircraft might make a mistake, and that might not show up until 2 flights down the road. But what's interesting with tech ops is the sole source reporting is very important, and I can't stress that enough. And we talk about it in CAST. How do we change this culture? How do we do it through InfoShare? Because more often than not, if one person is working on something and boogers something up, if no one saw it, it never happened. And I'll tell you from a manufacturer, like I mentioned earlier, we have customers all over the world at different levels of maturity in the just culture. And all of us are sitting up here, and these programs would not function if it wasn't for a just culture built on trust.
So true.
And whether there was a breach in data or the perception thereof, 10 years of ASIAS, 20 years of CAST would end immediately. And that's why it needs to be nurtured and always striving for that piece of it, so.
So the data is so critical, but only when viewed with the appropriate context. So I was a gatekeeper for the Autopods Association for about 5 years. Best job I've ever had. I learned more about flying jets in those 5 years than I did the previous 20. But I called a captain one time who had an unstable approach into Bermuda. And I said, sir, this approach was out of SOP. It was a high rate of descent. It was excessively fast to the outer marker, not within compliance of our SOP. I think it could have been done better. And the captain replied, well, the passenger in 3B under cardiac arrest thought it was a pretty good approach. And that was a valuable lesson learned, that the data points are amazing. They help us identify hotspots. They help us identify reduced margins. But without the context of the pilot report, and in this case, a gatekeeper reaching out to actually contact the crew to get the full story, without that, the data is not nearly as powerful. So I would argue that the ASAP reporting is critical, but also the gatekeepers and the crew contacts through your FOQA program are equally critical in helping us tell the real story, putting the color behind the data points.
Fusing the data is very important as well. And we're starting to see some carriers do some crosstalk and assemble both safety programs and put them together. Delta Airlines has pioneered that, and a lot of airlines are taking notice and starting to add that to their portfolio. And it's very helpful, like that situation there. You may get an overbank situation that pops up on a FOQA data, and when you get that crew contact in, you realize that, we were in some severe, moderate turbulence, and that's why we overbanked. We were going around thunderstorms, and that's why that data point was there. Well, that's a great explanation, because as we're looking at this, an overbank situation in flight is important, but without that backup data coming from the crew to say, this is the situation, it helps us color the picture better. So great point there. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our good partners at MITRE. And Hassan, I don't know if you're in the room, but there he is. Hi, Hassan. Those are the folks that handle all of this data. And when we say metadata, it's metadata. It comes in. Report goes to them, and it's locked down very securely. If there's one point I can make, is part of this trust is making sure that data does not get used in a punitive manner against a crew or an airline in their day-to-day activities. And so I wanted to say thank you for your continued vigilance and assistance in helping us with this project and program. Has there ever been any directed studies or something that we've learned and that we could point and say, we moved the needle on this, that this group has worked on, a success story, something that maybe perhaps, Vivek, you could talk about, that was a success for the business and a success for the industry?
I think if you really look at the history of SIS over the last 10 years, it's a result of exactly that. It's detecting the systemic issues that reside in the system and being able to then launch and get into the data and understand the underlying factors. In fact, if you look at CAST, the last 22 safety enhancement CAST has enacted have been solely based on SIS data. It's transitioned from a forensic approach to a more prognostic approach, looking at risk in our system or evaluating the effectiveness of our deployed mitigations. Are they where we think they should be, or is there something else happening in the system that we don't fully understand? I think TAWS is a great example of the initial study that was launched first in SIS. I think, again, starting with the individual reports that saying, hey, I'm getting all these TAWS alerts right now, I don't think the aircraft is in imminent danger. It was starting to desensitize the pilots to the last barrier preventing CFIT accidents, which we have mitigated pretty well in our industry. But that was what happens on a day when you get that alert where you always get, but this time it's for real. And when we got into the data, as good as the analysis was when we did it forensically post-accident, we still found how all the underlying factors work together, how the logic in the TAWS box operates, how we move aircraft through the airspace, how we establish minimum vectoring altitudes in the ATC world. It's independent of how the TAWS logic is working. We all assumed that the TAWS box always got the software upgrades, the terrain beta updates were happening, and more importantly, getting GPS to the TAWS box to make it more accurate. And data unreeled, well, we had some gaps. And we went in, and with the SIS data, we enacted new safety enhancements, and the SIS is now monitoring. So all those hotspots that we identified in the early days of SIS, in 2007 to 2010, we have not recorded a valid TAWS event in those hotspot areas since the third quarter of 2013. That kind of shows the power of the data, reinforcing, establishing RNAT procedures, bringing aircraft in on a much more predictable route, deconflicting with high terrain, changing air traffic procedures, and how that positively influenced and gave insight to all the key stakeholders in our NAS. From air traffic, well, they know they're going to turn you. You're descending towards a mountain. Pilots know they're going to turn, but the TOS box doesn't see that. And so we needed to change our procedures, and we did. And that kind of shows the power of how we can identify issues, take proactive steps, and eliminate and restore our safety barriers where we think we should be. So I think that's a kind of great example of how we're using the data in a non-forensic manner to make changes. And more importantly, we're using this operational data to not only do that, but also influence future design. As Metroplex changes happen, as new airspace procedures come into place, we have all this vast knowledge of how our system is behaving. We can address those and put in mitigations before we make a change to the NAS. And then we have this great operational data to monitor that the change happened as anticipated, or is there something else we need to do? So I think that kind of demonstrates the value that we can show on all the work that we've done in SIS over the past decade, that it works in that manner, in a proactive manner.
Yeah, think about all the data they have to digest. 9.3 million flights a year, I believe the number is, right, in the United States. United has 52 787s, and we have a half a terabyte of information per flight. I mean, think about the amount of data that's now coming, that's available, and how they have to not only look at that new data stream, the new data source, how they have to digest it, understand what it means, understand what's normal, what's the non-normal part of the data, and then bring it to the forum through SIS and CAS for us to look at it. Amazing.
You know, I think that the two operating words are reactive and predictive. I think we're in a
And
predictive
proactive,
mode
though,
now.
but proactive.
But proactive as well,
Yeah,
absolutely,
yeah.
yes. And, you know, before we were very reactive. It was only after an accident or bent metal that we would look at something. Wind shear. We had a number of wind shear accidents with fatalities. And what did we do? We put predictive wind shear systems into the aircraft, and we put low-level wind shear alerting systems at the airports. And we've put better training together. We've educated pilots, which is the key part, is that the education has to follow. Technology and systems don't fix the problem. It has to trickle down all the way to the cockpit and to the training of the crews, training of the mechanics, working with the flight attendants. It helps. It moves the needle. And the interesting thing is that you look at that. Controlled flight into terrain is a great example. But now what we're doing, our job, no kidding, I hope is Dana here, but we're trying to put the NTSB out of business. And that's the key, is making sure that we drive that accident rate to zero. And somebody may say, Steve, that'll never happen. Well, we're not taking that as a group on this panel as an acceptable statement. We're out there looking at predictive things that are happening out in the system right now. Things that seem relatively minor, we're starting to see trends that we could perhaps track and maybe move the course before we do have that fatality or that major accident. So, we're constantly striving, and great example there being TAWS, but there's other things in the works right now that we're watching trends, and some prove to be not a big issue. But the best part about it is when we sit down in a room and we start to talk this out, we get everyone's perspective, the manufacturer, the governments, the labor side, the airline side. We drop our IDs on the table and we start to talk about it and get to the root causes of incidents or issues that are happening out there. So,
and that's important. That's important because the risks are constantly changing. The things that we were worrying about even 10 years ago aren't the same things we're worrying about today. And unless you have that flow of information from these programs, you don't know what the risks are. You have to have some means of measuring it so you can be predictive and predictive in a way that you're actually going to stop the bad result. And so it's real easy to get lulled into this, hey, we didn't have any fatalities last year. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're in a perfectly safe environment, because accidents are a very poor measure of risk. Mm-hmm. And you have to be looking at that data to see what are you measuring? Are you measuring the right things so that you can be proactive with these things?
Yeah, I was asked at a senior meeting. They said, give me an example of proactive, predictive, reactive. And so I said, I'll give you a real simple example. A spill in the terminal, somebody trips and falls, slips and falls, that's reactive. Proactive is a spill in the terminal and one of my agents sees it and they clean it up. Predictive is that if we have a spill in the terminal, that there's a chance that somebody's going to fall. Now you got to put a risk ranking on all of that, right? That same, and risk being the probability times severity. High probability, high severity is high risk, low probability, low severity is low risk. So that spill in the terminal is high risk, high probability, high severity. I take that exact same spill and move it to the corner of the employee parking lot where nobody parks, that's low risk. And so what we do is we take all that data and then we got to kind of look at it and say, is this high risk or low risk? And that's how you start mitigating things. So I always use that as an example to talk to novices about, you know, what we do when we look at data and how we put a risk ranking on top of things.
Building mitigations, that's the key.
That's it.
I mean, I think, you know, if we, you know, we're all threat and error management people when we start the engines of our jets. You know, if we basically cut out all threats to our business, the better thing would be to leave the airplane at the gate and not make any money, because there's so much threat out there in our business. And you know, being able to create mitigations that's helpful for the pilot and the crew, is also in the maintenance bay. You know, all of this data gets collected and it's helpful. And so mitigations are the key. We're not going to outlive or get rid of all risk to the industry, but having proper mitigations and backups is important.
And when you identify mitigation, share it.
Yes.
Because we don't compete on this. We're all on the same team.
Absolutely. And that's a great point, Neil. You know, and as I look to the gentleman at the end there and I say, you know, here's Boeing and Airbus, cats and dogs, same stage. But in these meetings, the two of them are exactly on the same page when it comes to safety. You go try to buy a car, the first, you know, the salesman will try to figure you out, but then they'll start talking about the great airbags they have. Or, wow, you know, we've got this automatic braking system. You know, I've not been in a room sweating out the price of a brand new Airbus, but I know that that is not their primary goal. It's making sure that their vehicle is safe. And so that's the key here. All airlines are represented when we walk in the door. There's a number of other groups that represent each individual airline, Airlines for America, the Airports Council International. A lot of stakeholders are part of this CAST and the SIAS team who bring unique perspectives to everything that we see. And having that perspective is key. I think it's a really well-developed, finely tuned group. As you can tell, we're all, this is what we do. We sit and we talk and we work our way through some of the issues that are out there. And you know, these gentlemen here on the stage with me are very familiar faces and very good friends of ours, working through these problems, because if you walk in the rooms with your heels dug in, you're not going to get much safer. So, you know, I wanted to put a high note on that to say, you know, there's a reason why we're here. Again, it's to drive that accident rate to zero. I can't overemphasize that enough, and I think that it's very important that we keep looking for future risk. We start to identify mitigations to make sure that our business is safe. You know, great footnote on this is the fact that other industries are looking to the airline industry on how to manage risk and how to work through stressful situations. Hospitals, medical units, not even just transportation modes, but like I say, they're looking to our business on how do we handle this? How do we identify the risk? Because it is true, we're very successful at what we do, but that's not enough. We've got to take that rate down to zero. So that being said, I'd like to just take a moment as we close here, and we'll open it up for questions. I'd like to take a minute just out of personal privilege to say a big thank you to the gentleman at the end there. Captain McVenes, thank you very much. Captain McVenes is going to be departing the fix soon into retirement in how many more days?
8, but who's counting?
Right. Very soon, and we're going to miss a member of our family at the group. And you know, Terry, when you've been seated here as the Executive Air Safety Chairman, I was how many people first time here at the Air Safety Forum? I was one of you in the back of the room, and I walked in, and there's this gentleman at the podium, Captain McVenes, and you know, commanding and taking the microphone and talking about safety data. And definitely, Terry, you've been a great mentor to me. You've moved the needle for safety, not only on our side of the fence, but with your work at Boeing, and we do appreciate and we are going to miss you. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
And I know I'm going to pay for that later. Anyhow.
Yes, you will.
I will, you know that. So with that, we have a few minutes available for questions. If anyone would like to approach the microphone. Sir.
Hi, Ken Plunkett, Delta Human Factors also. My own little project is EFBs, and we're even doing an EFB survey. That's a plug for my survey that's out there now through ALPA and the Department of Transportation, the FAA. But if I'm, as a safety volunteer, I'm sure there's data out there on EFBs. Is there a way that if we have a project or an idea, where would a volunteer ask or inquire about any data that might be applicable to our volunteer work?
So I think you have the mechanism at Delta to, obviously, Mike Schilz is there, but to go through your point of contact and make a request, there's a process where you can make the request, and it will go through the approval process to the SIS team, and how that data, obviously with a safety case, could be made available to benefit and give insight.
I'll add too, because what's interesting with us, like Terry and I, please feel free to reach out to us, and I can put you in contact with our human factors expert in Toulouse, because then you can kind of get more of a global picture too, if you would like, for your study.
Great. Sir.
Told you I wasn't going to come to the mic, but I did. And I say this more for the benefit, and I'm going to try and stay succinct, of the news media people that are here. Captain Quiello, Captain Hoskins both brought this to mention. In a sense, we don't care who the actor was that brought the event to us. But we do take care of that event as a whole. We deal with the situation, get training for those guys, but realistically it is a benefit to the safety process that we don't go, well, this guy's a bad actor, so let's take him out. There have been approaches on the ASAP program itself that is attacking the data, this data that has brought us to this level where there are legal challenges coming towards it. At American, 94% of our data that comes through the ASAP program is sole source, which means if we had not the reporting system, we would never know about it. And because we don't know about it, we can't fix it. Those challenges and those encroachments on our safety system are extremely important in not only the legislative area, but for our overall safety. And I would like for all of us to keep mindful of that and your comments on how we can further protect those reporting systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Question from the Senate.
Here on what he said. Thanks to all of you on the data. So data. And 20 years ago, we couldn't get any data, and we had to protect the data, and we can't share the data, and we can't do this with the data. Terry singularly has been maybe one of the biggest effects in our entire industry. And again, as you go into retirement, I'd like to add a thanks on that. But data by itself is zeros and ones, really. So although we need the data to move forward, that's really just the start. And we've done an excellent start, and I think all of you and many, many other people in this room deserve a round of applause for collecting all that data. But right now, perhaps even the terabytes of data off our 787s, which what to do with it and how to interpret it. So as we get this data, which is important to continue to collect that, what do we do with it and how do we interpret that? And who's doing the interpretation and how is the interpretation being done? So on those initial data collections, the importance of labor buy-in was huge, or would never have the data to begin with. As we interpret that data, it's equally important. And there were words thrown out such as trust and inclusion. So I encourage, and there's a question in here, I promise, as the data goes to everybody who's collecting that data, and as they start to interpret it, whether through automatic means, and hopefully reinforced by the critical importance of subject matter experts in whatever area that data applies to get that information and do something where we can actually affect change. Because that, I think, is what we're looking for. And Steve, you had said something about moving the accident rate to zero. I'd encourage all of us to look well past that. It's not just about bringing that accident rate to zero, it's about lowering the overall level of risk in the industry and thus increasing the overall level of risk, regardless if it's with the manufacturer or in the NAST or with the individual operator. So My position, I'm with United Airlines. I work in the ASAP programs, which is why I gave the here over there. And we do want to share the data, but occasionally it's like, thanks for that, we've got it now. So my question is, as that data is given up and as the experts are interpreting that data, what are you doing for inclusion to reinforce the importance of how that's done, that it's not skewed in a particular way to make or not make a particular argument, and that the use of that data does indeed stay pure to actually help do what we all want to do, which is identify hazards and mitigate risk, and all of us get better. So again, but thanks for all of the work. I think it's phenomenal from where we started to where we are right now, and then just let's move us forward from just data to information, knowledge, and wisdom to use it correctly. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, internally at United Airlines, we have 4 constituents on the airplane. We have our pilots, we have our flight attendants, we have our dispatchers, we have our passengers. And so you have to take all of that into account. You have to have participation from all those groups when you're looking at data and you're solving a problem. Then you take that data set and you throw it into a SIAS, and then you get everybody who's on this stage and look at it from a system perspective. So I agree with you, Anna, that it has to be inclusionary. You can't somehow shut out one group or another, and that you have to work collaboratively for an answer, but also don't keep that answer too close to the vest. To bring it up to a larger group like this and say, hey, we saw this at our airline, are you seeing the same thing? And then when you do that, it's to pass it on. And what I do internally at United Airlines is I actually pass everything I see onto my regional carriers that fly with us. And so we're making sure that information flow back and forth is quick and it's relevant.
We're all technical people, and so we really like that word data. We use it all the time, data, data, data. But for perspective, we were developing the SIAS program. Steve said what it stood for. You'll notice the SIAS doesn't have the word data in it. We spent days determining what the title of this program was going to be because we didn't want to send the message that it was about the data. Mm-hmm. It's about the information. So it's information sharing that's important. And that was very deliberate, just getting the name right. So to your point, I agree that sharing, Mike, absolutely. It is that sharing that makes it powerful.
You touched on one of the major challenges of the data, and that is context that I talked about earlier. Once the data is validated, and we need pilots involved in that discussion of the validation, then we also need pilots involved in the analysis, which means both at the individual air carrier level, whether you're talking about your ERC reps or whether you're talking about your FOQA gatekeepers, or at the SIAS CAST level, we have a number of pilots that are volunteered by both ALPA, CAPA, and the APA that come to us to help us interpret that data. Without the line pilot's perspective, I think we're losing the real power of the data.
Very good. We've run out of time. I apologize to the folks at the microphones and the folks that texted things in. We'll be available off to the side. I want to thank you very, very much for sticking around with us today, and we'll be available if you'd like to talk to us individually afterwards. I'd like to give a great big thanks to the folks that traveled in for our panel. I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you for your insights. It's always a pleasure to work with you. Appreciate you being here, and enjoy the rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.